And this kind of storytelling is what I love the Sandman for, is we can get a one-off that's batshit crazy. That's so cool.
Yeah, I thought it was fun.
And it's still in the same vein. It's still talking about the nature of dreams, the nature of storytelling, the power that dreams give us in our mind, like what these desires in our dreams will give us in terms of motivating us to be the people we want to be.
Friends, to episode 238 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss issues 11 through 20 and episodes 6 through 10 of Neil Gaiman's comic and TV series, The Sandman.
Okay, so we have to address this right at the top.
Oh boy.
Brevard County being featured so heavily in this story was not on my bingo card for this project.
Oh, I love that. I had a note about that too. That's in the comic. Unfortunately, Brevard County, I don't think made it into the show, did it?
Well, they call it Cape Kennedy, which I went and did some research. I always call it's Cape Canaveral.
Cape Canaveral, yeah.
But it was called Cape Kennedy in the 70s, apparently. So
oh, interesting. Okay.
In the show, it's not supposed to take place in the 70s, but interesting that they didn't call it Cape Canaveral. But I mean, yeah, just the fact that it's in Florida and they talk about, you know, the Cape, basically, like the Space Coast is crazy to me. Like,
yeah, that's one thing. But then when in the comic there is an issue where they go to Brevard Hospital,
yeah.
which I don't think is a real hospital. Maybe it is. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
But that is literally the county that James and I both grew up and lived most of our lives in. So. Yeah, that's pretty cool to see. It's not a county you see in a lot of stuff. Let's just say that.
No, and I would never think that Neil Gaiman would be like, let's write about Brevard County, Florida. It's so crazy. Where'd
that come from? Who knows? That's a good point. So this is going to be an interesting episode. We have a lot to discuss. We've got 10 issues of comic. We've got 5 episodes of television. We're going to try and combo the 2, so we maybe won't be going as deep into the comics as you might expect from our coverage typically, but we will be making comparisons throughout and trying to touch on the comics as we go, but our focus is going to kind of primarily be on the show.
The show is incredibly faithful, so it kind of would be rehashing if we did both. So we'll talk about the differences and try to pick up on and talk about the highlights of what we liked in the comics still.
It kind of hurts because I have a lot of really comic specific thoughts I want to touch on, but and I know I won't be able to get to them all. But this is the way that we can cram our Sandman coverage into 3 episodes of the podcast, and so this is what we're doing. If you end up really preferring we would just draw it out and do each its own separate, let us know. You know, it would be good feedback to get as we continue to just try different things for different projects.
This tends to be the best way, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with Sandman. It's more television.
Television is tricky for us, yeah.
Feels like the way that we've found a way into it is to wrap both at the same time.
Yeah. Which we still might do for future if it's a really long book or it's really different. There's just every project sometimes requires a different approach. So before we get into that episode, though, which I wanted to, at the top, mention that we have a poll up on our Patreon right now to determine our next project. If you're listening to this episode when it comes out or the day after, you still have time to vote. It's going to be live until Friday night, basically midnight Pacific time. And it is down to 4 titles. The titles are Let the Right One In, Casino Royale, Fight Club, and Stardust, speaking of Neil Gaiman. So those are the 4 options. You can go, if you have to be a patron, but if you go on there, you can vote which of those 4 you would like to hear us tackle next, and one of those 4 will be our next project. We won't even know today, so we can't announce it, but hopefully by the end of the day on Friday, we'll have something picked out so we can start reading.
It would be crazy if we did back-to-back Gaiman, right? I can see a lot of those winning, though. We'll see. I'm not really sure what's going to win.
Yeah, me either. Also, I am going to be at Worldcon the first week of September. It's September 1st through the 5th, and I'm going to be on 3 different panels, and I have a reading. 2 of the panels are on podcasting. One is about monetizing a podcast. One is about editing a podcast, audio editing. Both of those I'm moderating. And then a third panel is going to be about adaptations. and that is with Fonda Lee, favorite of the podcast, and John Scalzi. And very excited to be on a panel like that. And then after that, I will have a reading. I think I'm going to read my story from Reckoning that's coming out later this year for free. So if you're interested in that, I'd love to see you at the con. If you're going to be at the con, say hi.
Okay, so yeah, getting into our coverage this week. I'm going to start off with a synopsis for episode 6. So when we left off last week, we were talking about an issue in the comic that we had already read that we didn't get to see adapted yet, and that's this first one here. It's The Sound of Her Wings. Morpheus, now aimless after obtaining his tools, is visited by his sister Death and accompanies her as she escorts the deceased to the afterlife. Death attempts to show Morpheus the possibility of finding purpose and fulfillment in his duties as ruler of the dreaming. In a flashback to the Middle Ages, Morpheus and Death visit a tavern where they encounter Hob Gadling, a commoner who vocally wishes to never die. Death agrees to spare Gadling for as long as he wishes. Hob and Morpheus continue to meet each other once every century. Hob maintains that no matter which turns his life takes, he still does not wish for death. Hob hypothesizes that Morpheus continues to meet with him because he is lonely and friendless, which greatly offends Morpheus. Due to Morpheus's capture by Burgess, he is unable to attend his regular meeting with Hob. When their usual location is sold, Hob chooses a new tavern a block away, hoping that Morpheus will find him. The two reunite in present day. Elsewhere, Desire continues their plans.
So this is a combination of an issue we already covered and a later issue that we did read, actually. I want to say it was called Men of Good Fortune, issue 13.
Yep.
So some new material here as far as comics goes, and some what we already got. You mentioned how much you liked this Sound of Her Wings issue. I also really love that issue, and it makes it into the show here in what might be the best episode of the show. I mean, I think it's really, really good. I think it's debatable, but it's just got a lot going for it. I think the Immortal story...
The combination of two of my favorite issues was awesome.
Yeah, the Immortal story is really good. So you also include that. They did a little bit of tweaking to make it work for the show, which we can talk about. But I really like this episode. As you can tell, I guess I'm saying it's like one of the best. Let's talk about Death, I think, first and foremost. What'd you think?
Loved her. I thought that she really captured that hopeful, merciful death thing that we had. She had like a good attitude, even though what she does is incredibly sad. And the interaction between Dream and Death, you can feel like a love and a connection, and like this, like we talked about this with the Old Guard, how like we can't fathom like what love between like eternal beings would be like, and just seeing these two characters meet was so cool to see it adapted. And I thought that they brought a lot of gravitas to it. I thought that like a lot of the story where she's having to take people along to the afterlife hit as solidly as it did in the comic, which I thought was going to be difficult to pull off. That baby one is fucking it's tough, man. That continues to be, I mean, really, really haunting, but powerful. And then and then the stuff that we get with Morpheus, and sort of, I love seeing Morpheus. I thought that Morpheus was kind of going to be this character that didn't change throughout the run. He's kind of going to just be this powerful being that knows everything and can do everything, but we're seeing growth in a character like Morpheus Dream. In sort of coming to grips with, he is lonely in eternity. He's the ruler of his own realm, but at the same time, he's not like omnipotent, which is something that they talk about in one of the issues as well. Seeing him sort of meet with this guy every 100 years was like so fun. It's so cool to see like the culture change, and yet the people in the bar are still saying the same things over and over every 100 years.
Kind of a running joke. Yeah, man, all you got to do apparently is just say out loud, I don't want to die, so let me just get it on records. I don't want to die. And if there are any deaths listening, come make a bargain, or any Sandman out there, and I'll be the one who comes back every 100 years. Sign me up.
Well, and that's interesting too, because at some point you would want death because everyone you love would be gone and all of these things would change. And yet, like, he keeps giving him the choice, like, do you want to keep living?
Yeah.
So like at some point he could just say, yeah, I don't want to keep living anymore. So you could just seemingly live for a really long time and then eventually welcome death.
Exactly, like that. Sign me up. Yeah, go until you don't want to go anymore. I think that's what we all want, right? Also, got to shout out Kirby Howell Baptiste as Death. I think she did a great job. We talked about how the most important thing for us was getting that there's this surprising warmth and friendliness and nurturing sort of nature to Death that I think makes the character so interesting in the comic, and that's what I want on screen, and that's what I got. I think that this is a faithful version of Death in that way, and I loved it. I loved her performance. That warmth came across, the different scenes where she's interacting with these people as in their final moments are heartbreaking. And we do also get some lines from the very final issue, I think issue 20 that we read. Some of Death's lines from that issue make it into this episode, where she talks about how, like, if she's the last, like, she'll be the last one in the universe and she'll turn the lights out or something like that. That is all from that final issue. Some of the only material from those later issues that actually makes it in here. Those last 4, which we'll talk about.
Yeah. A couple of things we have to note that were really fun with the 100-year thing is we saw Joanna Constantine show back up, but a different, generational.
Yeah, and she's in the comics,
or is that kind of saying that she's I couldn't tell whether they were saying she was also an immortal being or not.
No, I don't think so. I think that was an ancestor who happened to look just like her in the way that you can do on TV.
Right.
Yeah.
Because in the comic it's left something about she'd worked with Dream before. And I don't know. I kind of was thinking there was something else going on.
There's the first time they meet is in the tavern, but then at some point after that, but before something else, she does a job for Dream, and that's been mentioned now in the show and in the comics. So I'm assuming we'll get an issue later that shows some further adventures of Dream and Joanna Constantine.
Yeah. So, but in the show, it was cool to see Jenna Coleman again. At least we got to see her one more time.
And it sounds like maybe we'll get to see her again if we get a further season of this. Which, by the way, did you see if it's confirmed or not? I think I saw some rumblings about a season 2, but I didn't know if it was official.
It's all but confirmed, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it should be. It's doing so well, it seems like.
It's doing really well. Tons of buzz on social media and everything. But with everything, there's a lot of weird stuff going on with the streaming platforms right now. We don't know how expensive this show is in comparison to what they needed the show to do. So anyway, it looks like it's going to come. I also heard that there were clips that were released on Netflix's YouTube account that were clearly from issues 17 and 18. So they've already filmed some of the stuff from issues 17 and 18. And they removed those clips from YouTube. They have since been removed.
Gaiman said that it was going to cover 1 through 20 in the show, and one of my observations was that really 17 through 20, there's not much of that in the show. So it's is that make it into season 2, or do they just kind of skip it and go immediately to volume 2, which would be issue 21 and on?
I think I also heard that the show originally was going to have an additional episode, so I think some stuff is moved around, and maybe the editing process, they realized they wanted to end it at Dollhouse, where maybe they shot more than that at this point.
I do like that decision, actually. As we get to Dollhouse, I think that is a natural stopping point for season 1 of the show.
It felt like it.
It felt like the right spot.
Issues 17, 18, 19, and 20 in the comics, they are kind of standalone one-off issues, so it would feel weird to sort of end with one-offs.
I agree. I was kind of worried when I was reading them. I'm like, are we going to get this in the show? Where's it going to occur? Because if they end on one of these issues, it's going to feel weird. I
had 2 other things that I should say now. First is I watched the show first because I wanted to get the show watcher.
I thought you might do that.
Yeah.
I kind of went back and forth, but I mostly stayed ahead of the show. The only one that I didn't get comic first was the Immortal stuff because I hadn't read that issue yet. I was like, oh, this is an interesting addition. I wonder if this is in the comics, and eventually I did get it.
Yeah. So my reasoning was just that I wanted to have that perspective of people who are going to just watch it on Netflix. What is it going to be like for them? And then I was able to go back, and I think it definitely changed my opinion on it because I did feel like the second half wasn't quite as exciting and it wasn't pulling me in as much. It kind of felt like it kind of slowed down the pacing. It got bogged down a little bit with this Dollhouse stuff. But when I read the comic, in hindsight, I appreciated the show more. It sort of reacquainted me with what was going on and why it was important and how it all tied together.
That's interesting.
I appreciated it more.
Yeah. One of my concerns about that, and it seems like most people are fine with it, but I was thinking about how other than the Sandman himself, other than Dream himself, we don't get a lot of characters in the comics and in the show that are sort of consistent throughout the storylines that play out. You get a lot of these like couple episode runs for different characters, and by the end of the season, I'm like, every character we're watching right now, other than Dream and occasionally like Lucien or whatever, or Matthew, almost everybody's new. And now we're wholly involved with these new characters doing new things, dealing with new issues, and it's like, it reminds me a little bit of Good Omens in that way, because remember, Good Omens also felt like super stuffed with tons of new characters who all have their own little stories. And here we definitely had that. And like, maybe that's part of the appeal of the show. It's like, you're going to get all these new characters all the time. It feels like there's a lot of churn.
And I think that's intentional, right? It's like, it's almost like part of the storytelling process here is telling individualized small stories.
Yeah.
And in that way, it kind of feels like a Doctor Who to me, to talk about Jenna Coleman, that connection. Like the way that like you'll get introduced to these characters, you'll get invested in them, you'll go on this adventure with them, and then you leave them behind.
Okay.
And then like, you know, the story continues on with someone like the Doctor being the central key figure that keeps like changing and reforming as someone new, but still all these people are sort of just like orbiting and flying past this person's life.
Yeah.
Kind of feels the same way with Dream.
That seems like a good comparison to me.
But I appreciate it for that too, because I don't think a lot of storytelling is doing that, and it's also like early enough to where Neil Gaiman's building out the world, and then coming the second half, he can sort of play with that world he's created and set up at that point.
I'm wondering if it'll continue to do this throughout its run, or if we'll start seeing a lot more recurring characters.
I think it'll start to be a lot more recurring and like interconnectivity.
Yeah. Although I wouldn't be surprised if there still is a decent amount of like new stuff like all the time. Because I do think that's part of the way the comic works is the constantly new characters and new things to see and experience.
It also makes for fun situations, like one of the things I have to talk about from this episode before we move on. With the every 100 years, we see a Dream meet William Shakespeare and sort of make a deal with William Shakespeare.
Yeah, in both the show and I believe in the comics issue, they reference this stuff with the Fae and how he's like talking to Death when he first comes into the tavern. He's like, oh, the Fae are all leaving our realm or something, and she's like, pay attention to where we are and listen to, she like kind of cuts him off, and then that is basically directly referencing an issue that happens later in this run. So if we don't ever get this in the TV show, in the comics there is this production of Midsummer's Night Dream that happens later. And it's basically
issue 19.
Yeah, it's basically put on for a bunch of the Fae who appear in the play themselves. And it's Puck ends up playing himself in the play. Like, it was some interesting things happened there, but I don't know if we'll get this in the show. Probably not.
I think we might, honestly. Yeah. And I think that just to talk about the issue, because I don't know how much time we will have at the end.
Yeah.
I love that issue. My only regret is that I didn't have Midsummer's Night Dream more freshly in my mind.
Yeah, it did feel like because I've never read it, actually. So if I was super familiar with the play, it would probably help better.
But it was really fun and interesting to see that. And then, to come back to have Dream, the deal that Dream makes here with William Shakespeare is like, if you want to write these great stories, you got to write these two for me. And then you can write the rest of them, and you'll have all these great ideas and dreams.
There's an interesting thought put forward where he says all the great stories will always return to their original form. I don't know. That's interesting, right? Like the idea that there are these like great sort of foundational stories that are told again and again throughout time. It seems similar to, I guess, the storytelling theory people have about how there is only a certain number of stories.
Or the hero's journey kind of thing.
Yeah, I feel like it's like if you reduce something down to its base elements, then like, there are only a certain number of those. But that, I don't know, is it really worthwhile to reduce things down to that? Because so much of what makes a story interesting is not the base building blocks, it's everything else about it.
It's almost like thematically there's like similar themes that you always will get, but then that
are interesting to human beings, right?
Right. But they'll continue to give you different emotional responses based on like how the author wants to like thread those into the story and stuff. So I think that you're always going to get something different with ideas being threaded in.
Now, I thought you were going to talk about how Dream shows up in every different 100 years like a completely different costume.
Yeah.
And I thought it was funny. Early on, my wife made the comment that he looks like he's in My Chemical Romance. Like he's in the Welcome to the Black Parade video.
Right.
He's
That's
super
awesome.
goth, but he's wearing this, like, it looks like he's like kind of a priest. I don't know.
Yeah.
He's got some interesting outfits, right? He's got this like long black hair, and the hairstyles change. It was a pretty fun thing, and then seeing it in the comics is actually really cool too. How his costumes change like constantly, and we see a different version of Dream every time.
Yeah, I really like this. And then, like I said, blending these might be two of my favorite issues. So to blend them into one episode was really cool.
They had to change something, and I thought they did something really smart with it for the show. In the comics, the issues came out in the late 80s. So he is already free when they're supposed to meet back up in the timeline of the story. He's free from Burgess's basement. In the show, they modernized it. They moved it to like modern days when he's getting out. So therefore he is imprisoned in the 80s when they're supposed to meet. And so they change it and have him not show up. And that actually adds a really nice dramatic moment of seeing the guy come and think that he's been stood up.
Especially because he says the thing about, like, if I see you here in another 100 years, that'll mean we're really friends. And then so he gets stood up, and you're like, that what a gut punch that is.
Yeah, it's sad. And then, like, to see them reconnect at the end is actually a really heartwarming moment. I don't know. I like that a lot. And I think that moment works better in the show because of that addition. So it's a really clever way to use just an accident of the time change and use it to actually say something interesting in the story and make a plot point that exists in the comic and make it actually work better, I think.
Yeah, I agree. That really worked for me.
They had a really old Glenn Grant, by the way, scotch that he asked. He asked for
Nice.
like what's the oldest
oh
drink
yeah,
he
yeah,
got.
I
And he's
didn't
like,
think about
I got an ancient Glenn Grant, and I just think it's funny because I have a 25-year-old Glenn Grant pour that I've been saving for like a really special occasion. So I don't know, thought it was cool. I'm like, me too.
That's cool. We were talking about the development of season 2, so I want to mention this before we move into the next episode. It's just that, as far as I can tell, Allen Heinberg has said that they've broken the stories, they're working on the scripts, and they've spent extensive amounts of time like already working on season 2. So I'm very confident that like it's all been developed. It seems like the same writers, core group of writers are working on it. So hopefully they can keep this sort of consistency and bring it into season 2.
Okay. Yeah, I like that.
So episode 7 is called The Doll's House. In 2015, Rose Walker and her brother Jed are separated when their parents divorced. In 2021, following the death of both parents, Jed is placed in the foster home system, despite Rose's attempts to locate him and claim legal guardianship. Rose is unknowingly a vortex, a being who naturally attracts and manipulates dreams, and Desire and their twin sister Despair conspire to use Rose against Morpheus. Aware of Rose's nature, Morpheus plans to use her to track 3 errant residents of the Dreaming who are still at large. Rose and her friend Lyta Hall travel to England to meet Unity Kincaid, a wealthy, recovered victim of sleep sickness. Unity reveals that she is Rose's biological great-grandmother. Unity offers to fund Rose's search for Jed, and Rose and Lyta travel to Florida. Unable to locate Jed in either the dreaming or the waking world, Lucienne and Morpheus deduce that the rogue dream Galt has severed Jed's consciousness from the dreaming. Rose approaches Lucienne and Morpheus in the dreaming for assistance in finding Jed. Meanwhile, the Corinthian hunting for Rose is invited as the guest of honor for a serial killer convention.
Yeah. So this is the one where I had the note about, oh my God, they're introducing so many new characters. We're in episode 7 of season 1, and we're starting a bunch of new plot lines. We're introducing tons of new characters. And I just was curious, like, is this going to feel overstuffed for people, overwhelming? As someone who hadn't read the comic yet, were you getting any of that with this? Like, how did you feel about this episode in general?
Yeah, I think that this is where I started to feel like a lot of stuff was happening very quickly. And like you said, there's a lot of characters, and it felt like we weren't spending enough time with our core characters. And I think people, if you're just watching it for enjoyment and are really liking the show, I don't think it's going to slow you down necessarily, but I do think it's not going to be your favorite episode. Just because there's so much groundwork being done, there's some cool interactions that happen, but it's a lot of setup. So yeah, this was probably the episode I could point to that made it feel like I was starting to get like a little bogged down, and the story didn't have the same propulsion that the previous.
Well, it's
did.
kind of resetting now, right? Like we got our entire series of episodes about John Dee, and then we get the death episode, which is like a nice kind of cap on all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden we're starting something new. I mean, it makes sense because in the comics, this is essentially 2 different runs, and we're beginning the next run of comics, right? And we're gonna set up and follow their story. They tried to tie this back in the show, and this might have even been something from the comics. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe you remember, but Rose Walker in the show is on the phone during the diner conversation.
They did try to tie that in.
With that, I can't remember the name of the woman now who's in the diner who gets killed, and they made it so that they're like friends, and they had this like brief conversation. It is in both, so it's interesting detail. I guess it does tie the storylines together a little bit, but it almost feels more like an Easter egg than anything else.
I think it's for eagle-eyed comic readers.
Yeah, because I did spot her, and I noticed the rainbow hair, and I was like, oh, that's their version of Rose Walker in the show, and like I realized, and it says Rose, I think, on the phone, so that was a giveaway. But if you don't know who that is, you're just like, oh, who's this random person?
I think also at one point we're in Rose's like apartment or something, and we see a picture of her.
Yeah, later in a later issue, I think. Mm-hmm. So a couple things get introduced here that we should talk about. But before we do, I want to mention that one of the things I have seen that people are not fans of, and I do agree with this, is that we see Despair here gets introduced, and she is basically just an overweight woman without makeup on, and that is the personification of despair in this show.
Yeah.
And that's not a great look. Now, yes, she does like self-mutilate with this like hooked ring, and I guess that's part of it, but like I don't know. I've just seen some people posting about how, it's like, thanks a lot, Neil, but we're doing fine. We're not despairing or whatever. Like, it's one of those things that I don't think has aged super well from the 80s, and it's interesting to see that it's one of the few things that didn't really get addressed. And
right.
And I think that's because of this like fat phobia, to me, is like one of the newer sort of areas where we're starting to have a lot more awareness and careful thought about how this actually harms people. And you'll still see it cropping up a lot these days, even in like well-meaning, progressive kind of areas of art. You still see this stuff happen. We talk about it all the time with Stephen King, and we get some of it here with Neil Gaiman. And it's like, I don't think he's like a bad person for this or anything like that, but it just shows that like everybody has blind spots, and I think it's still worth calling them out so that people can be better about it, or at least realize what they're doing, and realize that this kind of stuff can be harmful.
Yeah, and it's not like they couldn't have updated the character. If this is, because I don't think we've seen Despair in the comic, have we?
We have, actually, yeah. We've briefly seen her. She looked kind of like this. She's a little more monstrous, I would say, in the comic, whereas they made her seem more like just a person here. Which I don't know what's better, I guess. I kind of lean towards more monstrous is better because it's less like identifiable, like as just a person. I don't know.
They updated a lot in this show, so you would think that they would have updated something like that as well. There's there's plenty of despair that you can portray differently,
Yeah, and it seems like they, as much as they are, willing to shift around some stuff, they visually are still trying to convey a lot of similar characteristics in a lot of these characters. So in some ways it's pretty faithful to the comic. I just felt like it was an area where you could have maybe done some changes, and like it's more of a criticism of the original character, and then I guess it's probably of like, if you're trying to be as faithful as they have been overall, the decision would have to come down to like completely change Despair, and that's a big thing to do. Maybe you should have done it. But the problem goes back to the original comic and the conceptualization, because like to me it's like, if you're going to imagine a personification of despair, there are so many other ways you could go than this. So it's kind of a weird thing to land on. We also get this convention. So these convention planners for this serial convention, and they are talking about trying to attract the notice of the Corinthian, and they are like collecting eyeballs in like copycat murders. This comes out of nowhere, and I'm curious as a show watcher, like, what did you think of this?
I thought it was so bizarre. I honestly genuinely thought that they were deviating heavily from the comics.
Yeah.
And so that's part of why when I reevaluated and read the comics, and like thought of the episodes in hindsight, I started to see like where it made sense to do these kind of things and the things that Neil wanted to try to address and sort of confront in ways. I think the idea of a serial killer convention is pretty funny and interesting and weird.
It's very funny, and this reminds me more of like a Good Omens kind of bit.
Yes.
But it's also darker than pretty much anything we get in Good Omens. This is a very dark, because it's serial killers, right? And we get some like actual pretty horrific imagery attached to what these people are doing. But it's on its face like kind of ridiculous and funny. And it's this really dark kind of black humor. And I know we don't get a lot of the convention here, but I kind of love it, honestly. I feel like I had a journey with it where I wasn't sure about it, but then I kind of came all the way around to just loving it. And now it's like one of my favorite things from these comics is the serial killer convention. So yeah, I don't know. I could see like people not liking it, but I just personally ended up enjoying it.
It felt a little hokey at first. Like it felt like such a weird thing to do. And then as I saw it happening in the way that the jokes were coming up and like the commentaries being made, especially in the comic, like in '89 when the comic was coming out, like the women are talking about how like they're seen as like black widows and nurse murderers and all this stuff, and they're like,
it's like a satire of conventions in general, which I'm about to go to a convention, like, and I've been to a lot of conventions. Like the topics, the panel discussions are some of my favorite parts.
But just imagine serial killers like addressing these
right,
things.
and the idea that a bunch of serial killers could get together and do this. It's hilarious, but also like it equates them in some weird ways to like the comic creators and writers and stuff of conventions and artists. They're collectors, which like a lot of comic book people consider themselves collectors. So it's really funny, and there's a lot of smart commentary there. Again, we're skipping ahead to an episode we're not in yet, but
it's being
cool.
set up here.
Yeah. So another shout out here, we got Stephen Fry showing up as Gilbert, and I think this is another one of those situations where I went, yes, perfect casting.
Sure.
Didn't know, because I read the comic first, so I was like, I didn't know that it was going to be Stephen Fry, and I was amazed. I was like, this is perfect.
So I couldn't believe the number of times that they cast someone, like all the people in the roles, like Nimrod, for example, one of the guys who's organizing, he, in the comics, when I got to the comic after having seen his portrayal, it's almost exact. And then I saw Stephen Fry as this character.
Yeah.
And then eventually would see the comic book character, and I was like, oh my god, perfect casting. I couldn't believe how good it is. And then just seeing Stephen Fry, like I love Stephen Fry. He fit the role perfectly. He's got that like whimsical British thing that he needed to bring to this character.
Very cool. So one of the things I initially struggled with is that like I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, and I have followed a lot of the stories of a lot of different serial killers. I just think it's interesting. Me and a lot of other people, I guess. I'm not alone.
I've heard that it's a little popular.
Yeah. And so when I'm hearing like Nimrod is super similar to a real killer that I forget his name now because I'm not great at remembering details. But I know that there was like I actually don't know if he was active before or after this. I'm not really sure.
I assumed that he was making reference to actual serial
That's the thing.
killers.
I should have looked up the timeline. I'm like, is he referencing a real serial killer here, or is this like something where he made it up and then like reality happened to spit one out that is very similar?
Whether Nimrod was one or not, there's a lot of different names for different killers that come, and I'm sure that some of them are referencing real killers.
Yeah, and so like I don't know. It's like that's kind of like tricky because it's like, oh, this is a real thing that actually happened. They actually killed a lot of people, and it's pretty horrific. But on the other hand, there's also like this weird culture surrounding serial killers where there are like legitimately fans of the serial killers. You know, they have their groupies, they have people who write to them, women who fawn over them, and you know, it's a really weird culture itself there. And I can see looking at it and equating it to fandom that you get at a comic convention. And so there is this like weird natural fit, even though as much as these things seem so different, you're like, I guess there actually kind of does make sense that it could be a thing if like something like this could actually happen. I don't know. Yeah.
So let's talk about Unity and like how Unity in the comic and in the show has come back around now, and we sort of get her story.
Well, it's kind of all part of this new plot line where we get Rose Walker introduced too, and we find out that she's the grandmother. She had the sleepy sickness, which ties back to the start of the run, where this is people who had this like eternal sleep while Dream was imprisoned, and then they woke up. And so she's an interesting character because she's essentially not lived a life, and now she's this old woman who is like still a child at heart, I guess, or in mind. Except she kind of lived a life in her dreams, it's implied. Because I felt like they weren't really trying to play up the idea that she was like still young.
She showed a lot of maturity for someone who, was seemingly a teenager in their 20s.
Yeah, and I guess that's explained by her quote unquote living a life in her dream. Yeah, I don't know. I thought it was fine. I guess I don't have any strong opinions about it. I think it was fairly accurate, fairly faithful.
Yeah, I like, sort of where the story goes with her.
Yeah. One of the more interesting changes was Lyda, I think, actually. Like, she's been made a little more prominent in the TV show. I think I liked overall what they did with Lyda. It made her a little bit more interesting of a character.
So Lyda was one of the only characters where I was just, a lot of the stuff that went on with her, I was not as interested in. For whatever reason. Yeah, I just felt like it felt like they were padding it out when I was watching it, because I hadn't read the comic and I didn't know what she did.
I mean, she just does, I don't know, she doesn't do as much in the comics, really.
She doesn't, no, and I think that's part of what it is I just felt like I don't know, her story with like her husband and the ghost thing and the way, that some of that takes place in the comic for sure. But it was almost an entire episode, it felt like, dedicated to or at least half of one of the episodes dedicated to that. And it felt like a lot.
Maybe it's spread out over a couple, I think, but you're right. I think if you add it all together. The dividends it does pay, though, is I think the moment where he sends the ghost back and he tells her a ghost doesn't belong in a dream. And, you have to go to your appointed place. Like, I think that moment hits harder in the show than it did in the comic for me. Like, in the comic, it was just a thing that happened, and it was like a function of his, and I was like, oh yeah, that's interesting, but like I didn't really have any attachment to their relationship. I was still orienting, because I think like you get introduced to the situation, and then within a few pages it is over. Whereas here it builds up, and like I felt genuine emotion about it that I think does work.
I think you're right. I think that was the intention there, right? It was to build it up and make it more emotional. I feel like I still felt the emotion, but I brought in obviously the baggage from the show when I read the comic. Yeah. But right. I think what it is for me is like when they were playing house, which the next episode's called Playing House. When they're actually in the house and like hanging out together and stuff, their conversations and they're having sex a bunch, like that stuff to me just like it bogged down some of the momentum.
Right, and you hadn't read the comics yet, so I think that's super valid, and that you're probably not alone, would be my guess.
But let's talk about Rose, because she's such a prominent character. Like, what do we think about Rose's character? Did they do her justice?
This may be controversial to say, but I think I like this version better than the comic Rose. I think they worked to make her feel and behave with more agency in the show than she has in the comic.
I think they aged her up a little bit too in the show. I think that in the comic she's like a teenager, like 18, and here she's like been to college.
I think she's 21 in the show. And in both she's like looks younger than she is or something, I think is said.
But in terms of like emotional maturity, like she's going to adopt him, and like it seemed more...
Well, that's what I was going to get at. Like her relationship to Jed, searching for her brother, that storyline makes more sense to me, and it was a little more clear what was happening than it was in the comics. And again, I don't know if this is just an issue with like me and comics, and like I'm not necessarily doing the work of like reading between the lines as much as I should be, but like sometimes when this stuff's playing out in the comics, I don't quite grasp what's happening until it's over. And then when it's over, I'm like, oh, now I can kind of see what was going on here. But for a little while, I'm just kind of like, who is this? What is she doing? I'm kind of confused. Whereas the show really like walks you through it more.
That makes sense, yeah. Because I mean, and that's been the case, right? Is like I think some of the time especially in the first half, there were things that we didn't have explicitly stated in the comic that we picked up on more in the show. And like I appreciate it for that reason. I like that they did more of that. I also felt like the relationship. Jed doesn't have a character really in the comic, yeah, and then here they gave him a lot more to do.
Well, he has his dreams, I guess, but they changed that quite a bit. Her story overall has the most changes, I think.
Yeah, and even his dreams, like the Sandman, the old Sandman, isn't him. It's some other guy that he's like imagining in his own mind. Like it's all just taking place in his head rather than him actually being the hero and doing all these things.
But is it a version of himself? I guess it's kind of debatable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it's kind of stated that this Harold guy or whatever was the old Sandman, and he brought his wife he died, and then he brought his wife into the like this kid's dream, Jed's dream, and that's they were sort of living in the contained dream world of just Jed.
Right, and we had this like what their names, like Blob and Goyle or something, like these like
something very
and that
like
gets changed to a different character in the show. So that's another like pretty big change.
I actually like that change a lot, especially giving the depth to that character where like she has developed and doesn't want to be a nightmare and sees the power of like being a dream instead. Like I thought that was very cool.
Well, and that starts to introduce one of the plot lines or character arcs for Dream that I think I talked to my wife about this afterwards, because the show does a good job of making you kind of go, man, Dream's a jerk. Like we see doing a lot of stuff where he's being mean to Lucien, and he is like very merciless at times. And she was asking me about the difference in the comic, and I was like, I think they took a change that has sort of already occurred in the comic. Like he is already different in the comic than he was before. Whereas in the show, I think they tried to play it out through the story a little bit more and make it more present in the storytelling to where we can see the change happen over the course of the season versus it's already sort of happened. And so I like that ultimately.
So you're saying that it's already happened in the comic?
In the comic, it felt like he was changed by his time with the humans in Burgess's basement. And I'm not saying he doesn't change at all, but like he is a little more constant in the comics than he is here. Here, I feel like we're seeing more of an arc. It's more pronounced.
Yeah. In terms of just him being more merciful, but also like understanding humanity more and his role and his relationship. I mean, his interaction with death was his understanding his responsibility, and this stuff with Rose is kind of showing his connection to humanity. And he even goes to, this is jumping way ahead, but he goes to Desire and basically says like, we're not meant to control them. They're sort of meant to control us and all of that we'll get into.
Yeah, that's like where that arc leads to, I think, for him. We'll revisit this again as we come back. I think we also get introduced to a lot of the people in the house here. And I wanted to touch on them a little bit. They're all really interesting in their own ways. We have Ken and Barbie, they're interesting, right? It's like they're kind of similar to what you would expect for Ken and Barbie, but he does a few things to make them a little more interesting than that. And I think especially Barbie with her dreams. Her dreams are really fun. They're like really fantastical, and they're really elaborate with like the names she has for everything. And she's this like princess who's got this, companion with her. And I love that made it into the show, because I was not sure if it was going to make it into the show. And I thought it was really cool when it did.
I felt like a lot of these characters, as I was watching again, I thought that these were deviations. I was like, these characters are wild. Like, what is happening right now? And then I read the comic and I was like, holy shit! Like, basically word for word.
Yeah.
Another character I do want to mention, because I don't think we'll have a chance to if we don't mention him here, is Mervyn Pumpkinhead, which is just like this janitor in the dream world. And the thing that delighted me about this character is, one, very notable that he's like a pumpkin head and he's like this weird dream monster. But in the show, I heard his voice immediately. He's voiced by Mark Hamill.
Oh, is that who it is? That's what I should know. I mean,
he's such a famous voice actor.
That's Luke Skywalker himself, who I'm named after, so I should have known.
But it has more to do with like his like he's using almost like his Joker voice from the Batman animated.
That's the thing. I'm not as familiar with his Joker voice, which I know a lot of people know him from, so that's probably what it is. So that's interesting, because I do remember seeing this character in the comic at least briefly, but I feel like they brought him forward and he like had some more lines and did some more stuff in the show.
I think so. I think this will be a bigger character going forward.
I assume
I don't think that you cast someone like Mark Hamill to voice act this character and not have like an arc or at least an issue or two pertaining to this character, like in some way.
Well, returning back to the house, we also get the owner of the house, who does these like burlesque drag shows. Interesting, very faithful to the comic, brought to the show. Then there's these sister lover, what we don't know. These two women, and they are like draped in veils, and they have the largest collection of stuffed spiders. They're super goth and in kind of ethereal, and like I was convinced they were themselves a dream, and then they end up just being weird people. It's really, really cool, and I was happy to see them in the show. A little bit changed, but for the most part, the same kind of thing.
Right. I think in the comic they wore white, which was a distinction that I was like, oh, interesting, because I saw them all dressed in black.
Well, they just had almost no color to them. Like I felt like they were just like really like they looked like ghosts.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which again made me think they weren't real, but they were. Part of it, they're blonde under those veils in the comics, whereas here they have like the dark black hair, which I think works with the whole goth aesthetic.
I loved Hal's character sort of like in his dream becoming this performer, and like that's his dream, he wants to perform
and viewing it himself too. Yeah.
And yeah, and putting on these drag shows in his dreams and stuff. I thought that was so awesome. And I was like, oh man, I wonder how in 1989 this comes off in the comic. And when I got to the comic, I was so pleasantly surprised that like he handled it with great care, and like it was done really well. And there's this like whole thing about he's like dreaming about, because I think it was harder for identity reasons in the 80s, late 80s, like that. Dreaming about like sort of identifying more openly and things like that. And I was just like, wow, like good on Gaiman for handling it in a way that I thought held up even today.
Yeah, I mean, and we're not necessarily experts on that kind of representation, but I agree there was nothing there that stood out to me. Maybe there should have been. I don't know. What did you think of Gilbert when he was first introduced? Like, did you have any theories about what this character was?
Pretty quickly in the show. As soon as he showed up to save her in the alleyway, I'm like, this guy is something weird. Uh-huh. This is a dream or a nightmare. I didn't think nightmare, but I definitely thought this is a dream. This is some entity. Especially because we didn't see him at first until that moment. And then it just became more and more clear to me. I was like, yeah, this is, and as it went on and there was like another additional nightmare that was missing, I was like, it's gotta be.
Yeah. Fiddler's Green, we learned later. My wife was onto that pretty early. I think it was next episode when they ride together, or maybe that was episode 9. Whenever they're in the car together, that was when she first guessed that he was Fiddler's Green.
I think that was kind of my period as well. I think I realized something weird was going on with the fight, and then...
But there's always something weird going on in this show, so...
Okay, so episode 8 is called Playing House. Despite Lucien's protests, Morpheus agrees to help Rose locate Jed. During the day, Rose and the other guests at the bed and breakfast post signs around Cape Kennedy, which attracts the attention of the Corinthian. That night, Morpheus and Rose travel through the dreams of the guests, eventually crossing into Jed's dreams, which Galt has manipulated to provide an emotional escape from his abusive foster father. Morpheus rebukes and punishes Galt for stepping outside her duties, though Galt maintains that she disobeyed because she believed it was in Jed's best interest. Meanwhile, Lyta seemingly reunites with her deceased husband Hector in the dreaming. Hector attempts to convince Lyta to stay in the dreaming and have a baby with him, and when Lyta wakes up, she is visibly pregnant. The Corinthian locates Jed and murders his foster parents, kidnapping Jed to lure Rose to the serial killer convention.
We're getting a lot more Corinthian in the show. I think they actually did a good job of fleshing him out as a character a little more here in the back half. And so I was thinking about what we both kind of predicted last week. I don't know about you, but I kept thinking about that and how I feel like we were both kind of right. Because you said you thought maybe the Corinthian was going to be the main antagonist going forward, and I was like, no, he's just a stepping stone to something else. And like both is kind of true, because he is a stepping stone to ultimately Desire's manipulations, but he is also a pretty prominent, if not the most prominent antagonist going forward, and especially in the show. I think I don't know. I guess it's in the comic too, but it felt to me like they just gave him a little more time on screen. He had a few more interactions with Rose Walker and Jed, which made him a little more like rounded. Like he had Jed out of the car and was like befriending him versus just being in his trunk. There were some differences in the two.
Yeah. So yeah, this is a cool episode. I liked that they were sort of helping Rose try to find her brother. So like she's found this found family, since she really only has Unity Kincaid left and Jed is sort of missing. And then I touched on the Galt stuff before. I like that this character gets agency and decides to, like, for the greater good of this child, because the abuse is just like so it's hard for even a nightmare to look at, kind of thing. And like the nightmare would come to the aid of a child that's being abused is kind of a cool idea.
And this is a pretty big change, because in the comic, it's these two characters.
They're little monster gremlin goblin guys.
They're little monsters, and it seems like they just want to like exist in this like version of the dreaming that they've created. So there's some similarity there, but the motivations are all different. It doesn't seem like they have any sort of like good motivations to me. And they are sort of banished by Dream for what they've done. Similarly, Galt, we see, ends up being banished here. And this is the part where I think they made Dream look worse, because Galt is clearly trying to help the kid and like mentions like, you know, he's being abused, you know, his life is so bad, and like I wanted to be different and I wanted to not scare somebody for once. And he's like, no, you've you know, done something you're not allowed to do. Casts her into the darkness, and this upsets Lucien, who like sees this as some sort of judgment that, you know, not allowed to change. You have to fit your role, and it's I really like this interplay where we're seeing Dream come to grips with his idea that he is got a role to play, he's got a job to do, and him projecting that out onto everybody else, but also like he has to learn this lesson about like, yeah, you might have a job to do, but there also is room for change. And that's like a sort of arc that we see more pronounced in the show.
Yeah, I love the stuff with Lucien. I think that having Lucien be like a voice of reason and pushing back against Dream's sort of like immovable rules, because that's something that's talked about, is like the reason he's created. So we can kind of see both sides of the story. Dream is the way that he is because in the past he wasn't able to stop the vortex, ending an entire universe or reality or whatever that was. Aeons ago, he says that like this entire universe was lost because he couldn't do his job, and he's like, that will never happen again. So because of that, he sticks to his rules so strictly, and he'll kill people who are the vortex with no remorse. He's basically doesn't show mercy to any of these people because they're sort of pushing along this vortex situation that threatens the entire, you know, collective consciousness of all these people. So he's stuck in those ways, and yet Lucien is seeing the good in these people and like what is good in humanity, and sort of like the way that Lucien is pushing back.
Not just humanity, because Galt's not human. The potential for these creations of Dream to themselves change, which is not something that we see Dream really seem to consider possible.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see Dream realize that outside of his role, like his job, he's also going to have this agency and explore what life has to offer in ways, and I don't know. I think that'll be something to track going forward.
So one thing that is different here, as far as I can follow, is Lyta being sort of impregnated by the Dream in the real world, and then he sort of lays claim to the child. And he says, I will, you know, that's my child. It was conceived in a dream. Because I thought maybe they were playing with something that happens in issue like 17 with this muse. And there's this mention of this muse. Unfortunately, I think it's kind of a icky issue as far as like.
Let's just talk about that issue now, because like getting to the end, we've already talked about 19. Let's talk about issue 17.
Yeah. Calliope, I believe it's her name, and it's this muse.
Homer's muse.
Yeah,
like back in long time.
Yeah, ago. And so captured by some author going way back who's now really old, and ends up trading the muse to this new like younger author who trades like this really gross like Bezoar thing for Calliope. And then Calliope is this like nude muse who is just like kept in a bedroom, and he's traded essentially sexual slavery to this other writer who like literally rapes her. And he does this to like get his inspiration to write his books, which works, and he becomes rich and famous. Now, as a metaphor for creativity and the lengths people are willing to go, and like what you're willing to give up and compromising yourself in pursuit of these dreams, I get it. I get why you make this decision and why you think this is a good idea, but ultimately it's not It's you're dealing with something that's very real, and it's unfortunately a trope that we've seen come up time and again, where it almost like lessens it, and by using it as a metaphor. I don't know. It's just like, yeah, it's just not worth it to me as much as I get why Neil Gaiman decided to do it.
Yeah, the sort of muse idea, like he wanted to like dive down into that, because we hear of muses all throughout art and all this kind of thing, and then the darker side of that, and the way that he, of course, being this like mythology sort of historical author, wants to play in the space of this character who was Homer's muse and is hundreds of years old, and is also to get to your point, is also the mother of one of Dream's sons or something like that.
And I thought maybe they were combining that with the Lyta story.
We kind of already touched on all this Lyta stuff, so if you're cool with it, we should probably move to the next episode. Okay, episode 9 is called Collectors. Lucien and Matthew deduce that Lyta's pregnancy is the result of Rose's increasing power, which threatens to break the barriers between the dreaming and the waking world. The Corinthian calls Rose with Jed, sharing their location at the cereal convention. Rose travels to the hotel to meet them, accompanied by Gilbert, a fellow guest at Hal's B&B, and a self-stylized gentleman. Lyta continues to meet Hector in her dreams and finds that her pregnancy is advancing at a rapid rate. Morpheus notices increasing damage to the dreaming, which Lucien attributes to Rose, though Morpheus is unsure of her theory. Morpheus finds Lyta and Hector in the dreaming and realizes that the vortex has allowed Hector's spirit to inhabit the dreaming, in lieu of him passing on to the afterlife. Morpheus banishes Hector from the dreaming and informs Lyta that her unborn child will one day belong to him, as it was conceived in the dreaming. Rose and Gilbert arrive at the hotel and search for Jet. While searching, the Corinthian and Gilbert recognize each other, causing Gilbert to flee to the dreaming, where he is revealed to be a personified Fiddler's Green, one of the other rogue dreaming residents. Gilbert relays the Corinthian and Rose's location to Morpheus.
Yeah, I love this episode. I think this is another really, really strong one, up there with episode 6 and episode 5, I guess, that is probably my favorites. I think the serial killer convention, again, to me, really works. It's fun.
It's so funny. And we haven't even mentioned the fact that like they're posing it as a serial, like serial convention. Like, so like, it's so funny.
Yeah, it's funny. And then just the idea that like they call themselves the serial convention, but there's no cereal. Like they don't even try. Once you get inside, like it's obvious. Now in the comics, I think they've like emptied out the hotel other than the convention goers. But in the show, I don't think that's the case. There's like other random people in the hotel. And like they're just having like these panels about murder.
Yeah, at one point Gilbert like goes into like different panels and realizes.
I thought that was really funny, man. Like it's a pure comedy thing where like he's poking his head into each panel discussion and then like listening to what they're talking about, and then we get his face as he starts to like with horror realize what they're discussing. It's really good.
It's really funny.
I wanted to touch back in with Matthew the Raven. So in the comic, Matthew the Raven gets introduced in this run, and he comes in and he is sent to watch Rose Walker. That's sort of his role. He's separate from Dream for most of it. He is this observer who occasionally comes back and reports. This version of Matthew worked better for me. I think this was a good role for him. I had no problems with Matthew basically going throughout the rest of the show. So most of my problems with Matthew were the introducing this character into those early issues where he kind of didn't belong, in my opinion. I understand why they did it, but he didn't feel like this comedic relief sidekick anymore. Now he was a part of the dreaming that had a role to play and was sent out to do tasks and was interacting with Lucien in interesting ways. So I liked Matthew going forward, and it's interesting that this is where it lines up more with how Matthew is in the comic.
Yeah. I bet you what they're doing in those first few episodes too is like they're having already read much further than we have as well. I'm sure that Matthew starts to become more of a comedic character, and they started threading that in really early. And like I said, just tonally, it was kind of like clashing a little bit. In our last episode, we talked about this.
I just wanted to touch back in on it because I feel like I that was like one of my sticking points, and I just wanted to touch back in and say like ultimately it didn't end up being a problem for me.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about was this idea of agency and the way that Lucien is seeing that like Galt and some of these other characters are gaining this agency, and how Lucien took over the dreaming when Morpheus was captured. And there's this whole there's this tension between Lucien and Morpheus. And it's because Lucian is like, look, I handled this while you were gone. Like, give me some responsibility. Like, let me have some agency here and let me help you. And basically, Morpheus is being stuck in his ways and saying, like, I control everything here. And I'll, anything that happens, I'll take care of. And that, like we've said, that growth that we see over time between these two characters is awesome. And Lucian's definitely one of my favorite characters. It's just this like librarian that has like every book that's ever been written or ever will be written in the collection, and
does a lot more in the show. Lucian in the comics barely shows up at all, honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that. It, gave the character more to do. Maybe this is stuff that happens in later issues. I'm not really sure, but yeah, I agree. Really like those additions. The library's cool. All good stuff there. We start to see Rose traveling between the dreams of the housemates. And it's explained that because she's a vortex, she's able to go into the different dreams. In the comics, we sort of get a series of dreams that we flip through.
It's its own issue. Like, basically this issue starts and everybody goes to sleep, and then over the course of this...
It's called Into the Night.
Over the course of this full issue, she goes into everybody's dreams, and they kind of start to blend together and create this vortex of all dreams.
Really cool issue. I actually really, really like this issue. And I just wanted to point out one of the specific comic things that I like too was there was a moment where we had the two, I don't know what to call them. It's the spider ladies. We had their two. It's Zelda and Chantal.
They literally call themselves the Spider Women at points.
Spider Women. Okay. And the way they did the dreams of those two was interesting because they play out simultaneously and they play out on top of each other. And the way I read it was that I read it from left to right across the opening of the page. And I think you're supposed to, because they do this thing where like a little bit of one image crosses over the seam. And I thought that was a clever thing, and this is probably a big comic thing I don't know about, but I was like, this is the hint that I'm supposed to read it all the way across because it spills over the spine of the comic. And so you go from left to right all the way across, and then you come back down and you read from left to right all the way across the bottom. I don't know. I just thought that was a fun way to play with it again. Like, again, finding a way to play it differently.
Yeah, it's funny how like sometimes you have to use like both sides of your brain. It feels like when you'll have to like remember that somebody's saying something here and then read something there and then cut back to that other side, like you're saying. And something else that I haven't talked to you about is just like a lot of it tends to be like top down. So whatever, like the hierarchy of like this bubble being above this bubble, being above this bubble, even if it's left or right in the frame, means like you go to that one first.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was cool the way he was able to manipulate it. And when we get into Rose's dream in the comic, like that was some of my favorite imagery is just like the way that she's like all encompassing and pulling in all these dreams and they're like flying around together and doing all this. So the nudity was interesting to me too.
It was kind of,
especially because like I'm not certain how old she's supposed to be.
Yeah, I think she's supposed to be like 18 or something at least. Yeah, but I mean it's like I don't know. Like
there's something natural about nudity, obviously.
Exactly. Like I never want to get too huffy about nudity because like ultimately like I'm fine with it. This is a comic made for adults. It's okay. Like sexuality is not something that's like bad inherently when you see it. Like, oh my God, it shouldn't be nude. Like, no, but like you do kind of want it to be like equal opportunity and not just like male gazy the whole time. I get that. So there is some potential stuff with that, but like I was ultimately fine with it. I feel like overall the nudity was mostly okay in the comics.
It mostly felt in this case, it also kind of felt to me the kind of nudity you would see of like angels or that kind of, you know what I mean? Where it's not supposed to be sexualized.
But I also was totally fine with them not doing any of that in the show. I felt like it would have been distracting. It would have been like a strange choice. And like, maybe that means that it shouldn't have been the comic. I don't know. If you have strong feelings about that, I'm not going to argue with you. I get it. It seemed fine, I guess, ultimately to me.
So yeah, keeping things moving, episode 10 here is Lost Hearts. Morpheus interrupts the Corinthians' keynote speech to the serial killer convention, but the Corinthian shows Morpheus that Rose's power enables him to defend himself against his creator. Morpheus informs Rose of the great danger she poses to the waking world, prompting Rose to temporarily restore the dreaming and allowing Morpheus to unmake the Corinthian. Morpheus punishes the convention attendees with clarity about their crimes, allowing Rose and Jed to leave unharmed. That night, Rose confronts Morpheus in the dreaming. Rose is ready to sacrifice herself to save her friends and brother, but Unity joins them in the dreaming and convinces Rose to transfer the vortex into her, allowing Morpheus to end her life. Morpheus realizes that Desire impregnated Unity to pass the vortex to her descendant, in an attempt to have Morpheus spill family blood. Morpheus confronts Desire, warning them against further schemes. Morpheus remakes Galt as a good dream and endeavors to act as a more benevolent ruler of the dreaming. In the waking world, Lyda gives birth to a son and moves with Rose, Jed, and Hal back to New Jersey. After being reproached by the Dukes of Hell, Lucifer ponders revenge on Morpheus.
Okay, yeah. I thought this was a really good episode, too. Right up there with the rest of my favorites. It's like, where to begin? One of the things that I think worked better for me in the show was the finale of the Corinthian storyline. He's giving this keynote. Dream shows up, says, you've inspired all these humans, and look at all the misery you've caused.
I also think that's an interesting point, too, because it's like, I think serial killers became more known, at least. Like, it was a thing that people were knew about in, like, the 60s and 70s, right? And, like, this is taking place in the 80s and 90s, and, like, that idea of, like, maybe the Corinthian, while Dream was captured, sort of, like, is to blame for the rise of serial killers and that kind of thing.
Well, we're not sure. I mean, yeah, I guess he's in, like, 1908. Like, this is, like, World War I era is when the Corinthian... we see at the beginning of the show, at least, and we see Dream get captured. Yeah, I mean, serial killers have been around a long time.
For sure, we just know more.
Yeah,
now,
we know more
yeah.
about them, but it's an interesting little theory that, like, I don't know if he's at the basis of all serial killers, but there's some implication that maybe he is.
At least making it worse.
And I think this whole reckoning that happens, where Dream comes in and has this momentary confrontation where the Corinthians actually stabs his hand because of the Rose being there and the power that gives him, and it kind of unlocks his ability to fight back. Like, his plan comes into focus a little more for me. Like, I can understand, like, what he was trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, because in the comic, he stabbed him in the hand, and Morpheus just took it and was like, I'm still going to unmake you immediately. But it was cool that they played with the idea that Rose's vortex is taking power from Morpheus in that moment and making him vulnerable, and he has to actually, it takes a combination of Morpheus and Rose, like, sort of working together to take the Corinthian
And it
down.
makes Corinthian more of a threat to Dream, whereas in the comic, he never really is.
It does change it, though. There's something to be said for that, like, super hyper powerful Dream, right? That, like, it's like you can't contend with. But I do think, in terms of relatability and an arc for the character, vulnerability is not a bad thing.
Yeah, it's not bad. And then we see him curse all of these serial killers with the full gravity of what they have done. They have to feel it now. They no longer can, like, protect themselves by making themselves out to be the victims, right? And the stories they tell themselves, the dreams they have about themselves, he strips that all away, and they're faced with the reality of what they've done. And we see that play out in the show as they're all dejectedly walking out. We see one commit suicide. We see another turning herself in. Like, we see this play out, and I felt like that moment sold that for me more. Like, I was cheering on Dream in the show even more because I was like, fuck yeah, he's really got him. I don't know. It's the thing that you wish you could do, right? Like, in real life, like, you wish there was a way to make these people actually feel what they've done, feel the empathy for the victims, and that's, like, one of the wild things about them is that they're literally unable to do that. And that's why they are able to do the things they do, and why you almost never see them, in fact, never see them, like, feel bad about, I don't know, like, express remorse. Like, you almost never hear about them expressing remorse. And if they do, it's probably not even genuine. It's probably just to get something. So yeah, it's cool to see that and use magic in a way to do that in this comic. I thought was clever.
Setting up this whole serial killer convention is a funny joke, but I was kind of like, damn, so, the Corinthian dies, but now what happens to these people? Like, they're just going to continue to kill. And yeah, that's a really clever way to have that satisfyingly sort of conclude.
And like, if you had any doubt about Dream doing good, him immediately taking about 200, 300 serial killers and making them all reckon with their crimes and not, we assume, not kill anymore, he's done some good here for sure.
A bit of filmmaking like around this time period that I liked was when Rose and Jed were like in her dream and like all the serial killers' dreams were coming in.
Yeah, that was cool. So we have that in the comics, right? We see some of these serial killer dreams or flashes of just their crimes, and like we see like some of the stuff they've done, and it's some pretty horrific imagery. And the way they bring it into the show is cool because it's Rose being able to dream walk through and she's with Jed, which also makes it like even scarier because now you have a kid who's witnessing these same horrific things.
Well, and she would turn, and it's not like she was like she didn't have a lot of control in that moment. She was like turning, and she would go through a doorway, and there'd be another one of the serial killers. So she was like trapped in a nightmare.
Yeah.
Dream walking.
Yeah, that was a cool moment. And again, like they gave Jed more to do. So this also is the finale of the Unity, which we were talking about earlier, Unity's plotline. And so Rose is in the dream, and she's now the vortex is on full display. Her friends are getting sucked into this vortex. It was unclear to me like what that meant, but then it's revealed like, oh, they're fine, as long as we deal with you.
Dream allows all this to happen, knowing that he can still repair it up to this point, but if it goes further, he couldn't have, and he tells her as much. I think.
And then like in both the comics and the show, I think it's a great job of like, we got to kill you to stop this, and I'm like, well, fuck, how do you get out of this? And then there's the reveal that they've set up of Unity was supposed to be the vortex, and it got passed on to her mysterious child, which we talked about is in the comics. We didn't know who the father was, and like, how did this happen? And there's she comes in and she gets the vortex from Rose, who is able to give it to her in the form of this like crystalline heart. And she takes it and then she dies. It seems like maybe from old age and just sort of like a natural death in the comic. It was a little more unclear to me in the show. It felt like maybe she died because of this moment in the show.
Yeah. She didn't seem to be as sick. Like she was really sick in the comic, and in the show it just seemed like she was
old.
Yeah.
It's like she was on death's door already. Whereas this made it feel more like she was literally just self-sacrificing. It's sadder in the show because she had this whole life that she wanted to have where she was going to have Rose and Jed come live with her, and they were going to be this family. And that's not in the comic. So like that being taken away from her makes her sacrifice hit harder. And again, like a few times where I see them doing that in the show where they're like trying to drive the emotions home a little more.
There's a part here where I would watch the show first, so I saw it happen, and it's this like moment that's almost like out of Scott Pilgrim versus the World, where she like pulls the heart out of her chest, and I was like, this has to be portrayed. They must be making a change here from the comic, but no, like it, literally exactly like it was crazy. Yeah. I was like, this must be some interpretation here. Like this is wild. She like pulled this heart out. She gave it to her. They like snapped it. That's exactly what happened. And I like it. I do like it. I just thought like, wow, that's really a big step to take.
Yeah.
Did you notice that symbol, that the heart that she pulls out is the sigil of desire? Like,
yeah, it's pretty similar.
So it's like that's kind of also showing Desire's impact on that whole situation there.
Yeah. So let's talk about Desire. Desire had some sort of plan to get Dream to kill one of his own family. And that is said in a way that is clear that there would be some sort of really bad repercussions. And he almost does it. Any theories as to like what that is and who or what? Is it God that would enforce this? The creator?
I think it's unpredictable.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a way to know right now, but I like the idea that there's another force at work. But at the same time, like these beings have been said to just be, basically outside of all other gods and everything like that. So the endless. So it'll be interesting to see like how they all come about. But the rules of not spilling blood is cool. I thought it was clearer in the show for me as well that like, if he had done it, something would have happened. And just that tension that's then built up, and then the threats that are sent back and forth. And then here we get most of their names at this point of the endless. So we have Dream, Death, Desire, Despair, Destiny,
and Delirium.
Right.
Who's the prodigal, I think.
I'm not sure.
Maybe.
That was
what I don't know. That was we've heard about Delirium. We hear about this prodigal who's missing. I assumed it was Delirium. Maybe there's another one. I don't know.
So the ones that we haven't met are Delirium,
Destiny,
and Destiny.
Very curious about them. Yeah.
I would love to know more about them. Yeah. And then we get this final confrontation between Desire and Morpheus, which I thought was awesome.
One of the things I wanted to mention is in the comics, I felt like it did a good job of explaining Desire a little more to me, to where I understood how Desire is sort of working in this moment. So Dream threatens Desire and then leaves, and then we see Desire be like, until next time, I'll draw blood or something. It's in the show. And I don't know, it worked better for me in the comic because it's explained that Desire is a creature of the present, and even the memory of what just happened fades immediately, or the import of what just happened fades immediately, and it's all about this like momentary impulse, and tying that back to Desire. I think that makes a lot of sense. So it explains the character a little better for me, I think, than I got in the show.
One of the other things that like is notable is it sounds like from Morpheus's threat, from Dream's threat, it sounds like Dream, Death, and Destiny are all on the same side. Because he says, like, do you really think that you Desire could contend with me or Death or Destiny?
Oh, you're right. He sort of allies himself with Destiny there. Yeah.
So that's cool to know going forward.
Yeah, that is interesting. So another thing that happens in the show, and it's in the comic too, but it plays out a little differently. But like, there's this final moment where Dream is on this beach, and he is building new dreams. And I thought this looked really cool.
Nightmares.
This is like in Nightmares. One of the coolest looking moments. The special effects I thought looked spectacular. And then we see Galt is sort of resurrected here as a dream, which pleases Lucien and sort of leans into the idea of like, I now understand that like I can change, and like you read in the summary, maybe going to be a more benevolent ruler of the dreaming.
Well, and he gives more responsibility to Lucien and says like, when I'm away, please handle everything for me.
And so a lot of that's kind of a change from the comics, right? Like we don't get a lot of that.
As far as we know. Yeah.
At least at this point, yeah. So I thought this worked really well. I actually really liked this final moment. And I like this edition of this plot line. I thought it was a good little capping to this arc that we got played out in the show.
Gave the emotional weight that I feel like I needed out of like all of the dreaming world characters. Like, I think that it adds a lot. And then in the show we get this final scene, which we definitely did not get in the comic, which is Lucifer sort of pondering, all right, here we go, we're gonna fucking... And also we see Azazel, which they say it differently than I do. I don't know.
Yeah, that looked cool. Like all the little faces coming through space and stuff. Like,
pretty cool.
Very neat.
Obviously we're getting more Lucifer. Lucifer seems more powerful than we've been led to believe so far. Just based on that final scene, like I'm like, holy shit, all right.
Yeah, I'm excited. I assume that's going to be season 2 stuff. This is kind of a little teaser of what could be to come if you renew us, and I think they will. I hope they will. But before we like make our votes, we got to point out the comics don't end here. There are 4 other issues. Now, we've already touched on, I think, 2 of them, the Calliope and the Midsummer's Night Dream issue. Now, there are 2 other issues, so let's talk about those. There's one called like A Dream of 1,000 Cats or something.
Which is wild.
And the whole issue is so wild. It's all from these cat perspectives.
It's literally a cat going on an adventure.
Cat goes on an adventure, joins a bunch of other cats, and they go and listen to this other cat tell this story that the cat has been telling over and over again about the time that this cat had a bunch of kittens that then got murdered by their owner, which was like a pretty horrific moment in the comic. And then that injustice, that cat decided to go, like, have a dream and like seek out this dream cat that that she had heard of, and finds our version of Dream as a cat, which I loved, seeing this big black cat they still had the stars in the eyes, but it was this giant black cat. I thought that was all really fun. And then the sort of like final moment of the comic is this implication that if just 1,000 cats could dream of a world where they were in charge of humans, and like where the big ones and humans were like little pets, then it would become true. Which is a fun little, like, what if that was the case kind of thought.
But it's basically said that, like, cats are too sort of stuck in their ways to change.
Yeah, it's like, when have you ever got 1,000, cats to do anything together. So it's like the implication is it'll probably never happen, but maybe. And then there are a few panels where we see what that world looked like, where it was like these giant house cats like chasing down and eating tiny humans.
But then humans rose up and coordinated and all dreamt together and took that over.
It was the power of dreaming that changed the world, and not only changed the future, but like changed the past so that had never happened.
And this kind of storytelling is what I love the Sandman for, is we can get a one-off that's batshit crazy. That's so cool.
Yeah, I thought it was fun.
And it's still in the same vein. It's still talking about the nature of dreams, the nature of storytelling, the power that dreams give us in our mind, like what these desires in our dreams will give us in terms of motivating us to be the people we want to be.
Well, and then let's talk about the other one we get. We get issue 20, which is the real finish of this volume that we bought. And here we have this character who's like Element Girl or something, or Element, and she's this collection of atoms that is able to configure in all these different ways. And she's like chain smoking at the beginning, and she's got something's wrong with her. We can't tell what it is. She's in this like room, and she's afraid of everything. And this is another one that I think the sort of underlying message behind it is not a very good one. Because it felt to me like, as a disabled person, and it felt to me like a metaphor for disability and being different and not sort of fitting the mold of society in every way. And the messaging was, it's such a horrific fate that she seeks death and tries to commit suicide over it. Now there are moments where it's that you could argue against that, where she goes to this dinner and the woman she's with starts talking about these freaks outside, and we see a bunch of disabled people, so very directly tying it, right? And she's like, oh, they're not freaks, they're just living their lives out there, and kind of in defense of her. But then her face falls off and she runs out, and she's like, her life is so horrific that she wants to end it. Yeah, and then death shows up.
I don't have that experience, so like I didn't interpret it that way. But so my view on it was, because the issue is called Facade, and like as we entered into this idea of a superhero, Element Girl, who over time loses this identity or in some way, I saw it as this like commentary on the idea of how naive superhero storytelling can be, in the way that they have this alter ego, this other face that they put on, and that's what people see. And then when it's dropped, the trauma and the actual like human being and what it would be like to actually have to contend with the things that these heroes have to, because very few superheroes deal with the trauma of like what goes on and everything. And then this character, I interpret it as a character who, like, we're seeing the humanity of the person behind a false mask.
Yeah, no, and I think that's there, right? We see these faces on the wall. She's not able to discard them. They're parts of who she is. She's using one as an ashtray at one point. So I think that's there too, and I think you're touching on what Gaiman's going for here. I just think there's some unfortunate readings of this that I think it also is leaning into, because, as I said, they directly point at a bunch of people and say so.
Yeah. And that's obviously there's a few of those issues we've touched on at this point where like things haven't held up quite as nicely.
A few of them right here at the end too. So, and then we get Death show up. She's there for someone else, but she has overheard her crying and just stops by to talk to her, this Element Girl. And this is where we get some of the lines that made it into like episode 6 of the show. And
this is really interesting too, because it's like she wasn't there for her, but this a conversation with Death might bring about death. Yeah. Is what it seems like, because she
tells her basically how to do it. Yeah, she's like, if you really want to be done, you got to talk to Ra. So it's also tied to this like Egyptian thing, which I assume is something from the actual comic of Element Girl. This is not a character I know about.
Oh, I'm not sure.
I assume it's
I don't know anything.
Well,
about
it said at the bottom of the issue, like the title page of the issue, like Element Girl created by, and it was like 2 other names. So I think this is like an existing character.
I knew it was an existing character. I'm just not familiar with the character at all. So I have no idea what the backstory is there. But I this is also another opportunity for Gaiman to flex his like mythology thing where he loves to reference these mythologies, and so bring in the Egyptian mythology with Ra is pretty cool.
Okay, so these 4 issues here at the end of the comic run. And I felt like these were some of the weakest. There were some fun moments, like the cat stuff. I thought was pretty fun. Some of Midsummer's Night Dream was cool. Again, I don't think I fully appreciated it because I wasn't as familiar with the actual play. I think it would have worked a little better.
Yeah, I actually really did like that one. I think I would have loved it had I been more familiar with it.
And then we had the Muse Calliope one, which was I don't know, and then this Element Girl one, which was the final issue. I didn't think was that great, so we end on, to me, a kind of a weaker note. So all that being said, now I want to take our moment to decide what was the better version of Sandman. Now we are only going to compare Volume 1 and Season 1 of the show, leaving door open for differing opinions going forward. Now, our very first episode on Sandman, we both absolutely love the comic, and we said, I don't know if there's any way the show is going to be able to contend with this comic. But I think we were both in agreement that this is a good adaptation. Maybe not perfect, but also the comics aren't perfect. And we read more comic, and we got more show. So who wants to go first? Where are we at now?
This is a great show. This is like one of the, I would say this is one of my favorite shows on Netflix for sure. Like no question, just in terms of what they created, the changes that they made and the updates that they made, I thought were all extremely smart. They were great updates, good notes, good changes, and fleshed out characters in ways. I think you lose a little bit of the like, is that you? Fire alarm?
So that was interesting. Fire alarm went off and went outside for a good half hour or so. But now it's not going anymore, and we came back up. But yeah, that's what happened. If the energy seems different, a little
sun break. You get to go outside, be in the sun, walk around.
Yeah, it's pretty warm out. Anyway, I believe you were in the middle of giving us your take on what was better. Do you remember? Hopefully you can remember what you were saying.
I kind of do, yeah. So what I was saying basically was, I think you miss out on some of Dream being this like mysterious, powerful entity, and you get more of that grounded human take on him in the show. And like, I feel like you could go either way with that. It's just up to preference, like what you prefer in terms of that. But relatability and being adapted for a show, like I kind of understand the direction they went. But I'm going to take the comic here. And I know that there are things that we really disliked, and the updates were significant. I think the updates were needed as well. Like they were good updates. That stuff, like just some of the stuff just doesn't hold up in the comic. But in terms of like the artistry and I think the impact for this comic, like just reading through and getting to fall in love with another comic series, and it's that sort of blend of the written and visual medium. So it's like a middle ground for us a little bit. So I enjoy that space. And just overall, the what they captured with this character that's become iconic, and the art style is so uniquely its own. And I've talked about the cover pages, how they're like sort of realism, sort of photography kind of things.
Continue to be really
there's just so much about it that I like visually, and then the storytelling is really strong. And with it being the source.
And you're a big comics fan. If people are surprised to hear this, you're a big comics guy too, in addition to being a movie connoisseur.
And that's kind of why I couched it in the idea that like it is a visual medium that I can kind of look at cinematically and like analyze it in those ways. And I just think there's a lot going on for it here. I do think that going forward, I haven't read more of the comic or the show, but I think going forward, the show could overtake the comic for me because of how good some of the changes have been. But currently, like where we're at, I just love sort of the framework of what they've set up with the comic. And like I said, one of my favorite shows on Netflix. I am dying for more of the show, but I'm taking the comic here.
Okay. So I already had my opinion established, so I haven't been influenced by you. Okay, so in our first episode, I said it's going to be a really tall order for the show to overtake the comic because I was loving the comic so much. Felt like it's definitely my shit. In the second part that we read of the comics, continued to be really cool, definitely up my alley. But we talked about how the final few issues were these sort of one-offs. And I wanted to ask you, actually, if we can just take a moment, is this something that's common in like big comic runs where Every now and then between like arcs that are all linked, you'll get a few kind of standalone issues. Is this a common comic thing?
I would say the idea of having like a large comic run and having one-off stories that are sort of not necessarily connected to the overarching like run, that's definitely common.
Okay.
But I think this comic does it in ways that other comics would never be so bold as to do.
Okay.
Like it you know, like totally, like it might just be like Batman goes to the beach or something, you know what I mean? Like a one-off.
So there is some occasionally stuff like that.
There's definitely stuff like that in most comics, I would say. There's usually like an issue here or there that doesn't necessarily like go along with the overarching story. But this, like I said, these are like the way that these are still threaded back in thematically and to flesh out the world. Like I find it to be so unique.
So I did think that these were some of the weakest issues at the end here. And to me, that made the comic kind of sputter a little bit. And it didn't end as strong a note as the end of issue 16 was, which granted was there in the comic. So kind of overstayed its welcome a little bit for me. Not that I completely disliked everything that happened at the end, but you know, that combined with the fact that the show ends, I think, in a better place, a smart place. I think it's a good adaptation. I think, you know, in many ways modernized. I think they did some clever work with the character, to where the show all of a sudden rises up and actually comes within striking distance to me of the comic. And I didn't think this was possible. And by the end of it, I was like, wow, maybe it is going to be the show. But I sat with it for a bit and really thought on it. And ultimately, I'm going to agree with you, and I'm going to give it to the comic. But it was a close contender, and I didn't think we were going to get there. So that is, I think, to me, a testament to how good the show is more than anything else. The comic art style, fantastic. Storytelling is so good. Something about Dream, I think, is the thing that wins over the comic for me. As much as I like this portrayal, and I think it's like it's gonna happen because you've taken this inhuman character and given it a human actor, right? Like I've talked about how that already is gonna ground the character, but just the way Gaiman is able to convey this eternal being, this endless being, and the power that Dream has tied to his realm, and the way he can sort of break reality in the comic comes across in such a cool way that I don't think the show hasn't quite risen to that level. There are moments, like when he's standing on the beach, in the first episode when he's sitting in the chair and the roof comes off. Like, there are moments that approach it, but that happens so much in the comic, and it's always so cool, and it's in different ways constantly. Whereas still fairly often he just feels like he's a guy in the show. I think that's the thing that sets the comic apart for me. Neither are perfect, but I'm going to give it to the comic, which, you know, I'm not a big comics guy. I'm still fairly new to the medium, although at some point I guess I'm going to have to stop saying that because now I've read a lot of the biggest runs, the coolest, you know, most respected comics there are. But still, like, I didn't grow up with them, so I don't know. I always feel like I'm kind of a newbie to it. I loved it, and the inventiveness on display with like how they did the paneling and everything. So cool. So it sounds like we're both in agreement. Ultimately, it's going to be the comic, which is one of the best comics of all time, one of the most legendary comics of all time. So I think that's appropriate, but good show. Liking the adaptation. Would be excited to come back for season 2. Maybe they'll do like volume 2 and we can do a similar kind of coverage. If that's something you'd like to hear us do, let us know, because we'll be more likely to do it if we hear from our listeners if that's something they want.
Selfishly, I would like to do that. Season 2, like I'd like to continue the story. Otherwise, I'm going to have to continue the comics because I really want to keep going. I
agree. Okay, so we don't know exactly what we're going to be covering next week. It's going to come down to that poll, so if you'd like to influence it, make sure to check us out. So it's on patreon.com/inktofilm. You go on there, you'll be able to vote. You'll also be able to listen to all of our monthly exclusive bonus episodes we do, and we'll continue to release every month. So hopefully check that out, patreon.com/inktofilm.
If you wanted to help out the podcast in another way, you could leave a rating or review on whatever platform you're listening on. I know Apple Podcasts is a big one, Spotify, like wherever you're listening, we appreciate those, and it helps to get the word out and keep the podcast growing.
Yeah, speaking of getting the word out, we're on social media. We're at Ink2Film on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Connect with us. Also, if you see our posts on there and you like the episode, feel free to share them. We would love to see that. Share them to your networks. We're not a huge show, and we'd like to get the word out, and word of mouth is a great way to do it.
And thank you to Jeremy Blake for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, so here we are at the end of our Sandman coverage, and I was just thinking about how I often fall asleep with podcasts playing in my ears, and how theoretically, someone could be doing that. In fact, I've heard from at least one person that they have fallen asleep with us in their ears. So if that's the case, we are sort of in this like liminal dreaming space, and we ourselves are Sandmen.
Yeah, we'll see you in the dreaming.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Until next time.
Keep adapting.